ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Daniel Holman.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's good to be here. I was here in Palm Springs probably about 6 or 7 years ago to talk about the Tuskegee Airmen. Is there anybody here who was there then? Okay, a couple of you were. This won't be an exact duplicate of what I said before. Unfortunately, Bob Friend is not here anymore, but he came to both of my talks when I came before to Palm Springs. I'll be talking about the Tuskegee Airmen in history, and the first half or so of this talk will be an introduction to what the Tuskegee Airmen did, who the Tuskegee Airmen were, how they got started, what they actually did overseas. The last part of the talk will be about misconceptions about the Tuskegee Airmen. And I'll be talking about some of the books I've written about the Tuskegee Airmen. At the end of this program, after the questions and answers, there will be 2 of my books available for sale, and I'll be glad to autograph them for you if you'd like. I don't have a whole lot of copies, but one of them is the Tuskegee Airmen Chronology, and the other one is Misconceptions about the Tuskegee Airmen. And I'll be making them available for just $10 each. I'm not making any money off of it, but I do want to make available some of the books that I've written about the Tuskegee Airmen. I worked at the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama, for 37 years. And during that time, I became very acquainted with some of the histories of the Air Force units. As many of you are aware of already, the Air Force is divided into units, squadrons assigned to groups, assigned to wings, assigned to numbered air forces, and so on. And the histories of all those different Air Force organizations are saved and kept on both paper and microfilm, and now digitally too, at the Air Force Historical Research Agency. I don't still work there. I retired in 2019 after 37 years, but I still know a lot about them. If I make a mistake and tell you something about where I work, that's left over from when I used to work there. But the Air Force Historical Research Agency is an excellent place to find primary source documentation. I heard one time somebody say that we'd better interview the few surviving Tuskegee Airmen that are still living, because that's the only way we'll know what they did. Well, that's not exactly a true statement, because we know what they did partly from what Tuskegee Airmen wrote in their mission reports and their narrative mission reports and their histories written by Tuskegee Airmen themselves during World War II. So a lot of the documentation on which this is based is from Tuskegee Airmen themselves, what they wrote during World War II. For many years, the military, the U.S. military, did not allow blacks to fly. The Army obtained its first military airplane around 1909. And for more than 30 years, blacks were not allowed to fly in the American military. In the Army, and the Navy, and the Marine Corps, there were no black pilots. And there were some black pilots who flew in the military organizations of other countries. One of them was Eugene Bullard. You see a picture of him there. Eugene Bullard flew in World War I for France. He was an American, but he flew for France because he couldn't fly for his own country. He wasn't allowed to serve in the Army Air Service. He was one of several black pilots who flew for the military of other nations. Another example is John Robinson. In the 1930s, he flew for Ethiopia. So there were black military pilots before the Tuskegee Airmen, but the Tuskegee Airmen were the first black military pilots in American military service. In 1940, Franklin D. Roosevelt was running for president for a third time. This is the first time a person ever decided to run for president a third time. And one of the things he promised during that 1940 campaign was that he would allow black pilots to serve in the Air Corps. The Air Corps had been established in 1926. It was the successor to the Air Service and the predecessor of the Army Air Forces and the U.S. Air Force. So Franklin D. Roosevelt fulfilled his promise, and in March of 1941, the first black military organization, black flying military organization was constituted and activated at Chanute Field, Illinois. It was the 99th Pursuit Squadron. It didn't have any pilots left yet. The pilots would have to be trained. But the War Department announced early in 1941, January of 1941, that this first black flying unit would have pilots trained at Tuskegee. After the constitution and activation of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, Eleanor Roosevelt, who you see in the picture, flew with Chief Anderson. Charles Anderson was a civilian pilot instructor. Civilian pilot training had started at Tuskegee Institute back in 1939, but in 1941, the military pilot training started after the constitution and activation of the 99th and after Eleanor Roosevelt's visit to Tuskegee. The first black flying organization, military flying organization, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, would eventually become the 99th Fighter Squadron. It moved from Chanute Field, Illinois to Tuskegee, where the pilots would be trained. There were 3 phases of flight training, as many of you know, during World War II. The first phase, the primary phase, used airplanes like this: P-17, P-13, P-19 airplanes. The P-17 and P-13 are like the ones you see in the picture. They were biplanes. It wasn't just black trainees that used that in the primary flight training. White pilots used the same kind of planes. The only difference between the PT-17 and the PT-13 was the engine. Otherwise, the plane looked the same. The PT-19 was a monoplane primary trainer, and there's one on display in another part of this museum. The next 2 phases of flight training were the basic flying training and the advanced flying training, and they took place at a larger airfield at Tuskegee Army Airfield, which was several miles to the northwest of where Moton Field was. Moton Field was a Tuskegee Institute facility that was under contract with the War Department to provide the primary flight training. But the basic and advanced flight training were conducted at Tuskegee Army Airfield. At first, all the instructor pilots at Tuskegee Army Airfield were white. And the reason for that was because there were no black pilots in the American military yet. So in 1941, the basic and advanced flight training started at Tuskegee Army Airfield, much larger airfield to the northwest of Moton Field, owned by the Army Air Forces. 3 of the hangars that were at Tuskegee Army Airfield still exist. They were moved in 1946 when Tuskegee Army Airfield closed to airports at Troy, at Montgomery, and at Clanton, Alabama. And I took pictures of them. They all have the same basic size and shape, but they're in different stages of preservation. But those hangars still exist, even though Tuskegee Army Airfield is just out in the country in ruins. About the only thing left of Tuskegee Army Airfield today is just the ruins of the runways, and it's fenced off. If you go to Tuskegee today, you'll see Moton Field, the Tuskegee Airport, and it's also the home of the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. That's where the primary flight training took place. It's not where the basic and advanced flight training took place. The commander of Tuskegee Army Airfield, where the basic and advanced flight training took place, was Colonel Noel Parrish, and he was well remembered by many of the Tuskegee Airmen. Most of the Tuskegee Airmen remembered he was a fair man who was truly interested in their success. And he proved that in several ways. One of them was by racially integrating facilities at Tuskegee Army Airfield that had once been segregated on the base. There were facilities at first for black personnel and facilities for white personnel. And he made sure, because of a change in War Department regulations over World War II, that he would conform to those regulations, and he helped integrate the facilities at Tuskegee Army Airfield. And Noel Parrish is actually honored by the Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated with an award every year. There's an award presented to a member of Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated, usually a Tuskegee Airman himself, and it's called the Noel Parrish Award, named after this man. The Tuskegee Airmen started flight training in 1941, but the first pilots graduated in March of 1942. So it was about a year between the constitution and activation of the 99th Pursuit Squadron and the graduation of the first pilots. First pilot class started with the 3 phases with 13 personnel. And by the time it finished, there were only 5 left. So there was a weeding out process. The pilots that are would-be pilots that did not complete the training went off to other vocations. But there were 5 pilots who graduated in the first class. There were a total of 77 classes. Later classes were a lot larger than the first class of 5. But the training of the pilots had started. And they wouldn't go overseas, those pilots, the 99th Fighter Squadron wouldn't go overseas for another year. So if you think about it, March 1941, the 99th Pursuit Squadron was activated. March 1942, they got their first pilots. Spring of 1943 is when they first went overseas. So it took a long time for black pilots to finally enter combat overseas. When they trained in their basic flight training, it was BT-13 aircraft they used. I don't think there's one on display here at the museum. But for the advanced training, that took place in AT-6 aircraft. Now that's for the fighter pilots. There were some Tuskegee Airmen pilots who trained to be bomber pilots, to be B-25 bomber pilots. And they trained in AT-10 aircraft. As I said, there were 77 classes altogether. The total number of pilots, black pilots, trained at Tuskegee Army Airfield during World War II was 992, so just short of 1,000 black pilots. Only about 355 of them actually deployed overseas to combat. This is a symbol of the 99th Fighter Squadron. I'll let you look at that emblem for a little while and see if you can see any numerical significance, any symbolism in that emblem. Can you see anything that might let you know what their number is? Yes, okay, 9 stars and 9 segments around the circle. So they wanted people to know 9 and 9, 99. The 99th Pursuit Squadron became the 99th Fighter Squadron and went overseas, went first to North Africa. It arrived in North Africa after Tunisia had fallen to the Allies. So the Tuskegee Airmen didn't have anything to do with the conflict with Rommel in North Africa because that had already taken place. But they did launch their first combat missions in P-40s for the 12th Air Force, and they were flying from Tunisia against islands in the Mediterranean, islands like Pantelleria. Later they went to Sicily and took part in operations there. Later they went to Italy and took part in operations there. The 99th Fighter Squadron was one of many P-40 units, but at first it didn't have a group to be assigned to. And so it was attached to a white fighter group that already had 3 fighter squadrons, 3 P-40 fighter squadrons assigned to it. And one of the commanders of one of those white fighter groups to which the 99th Fighter Squadron was attached didn't really think they should be in combat. And he tried to take them out of combat. He wrote a letter that went all the way up the chain and said they weren't flying as well as the other P-40 squadrons. They should be taken out of frontline combat. The letter went all the way up the chain to the head of the Army Air Forces, Hap Arnold. And fortunately, Hap Arnold decided to turn the matter over to the War Department. They did a study, and they compared the P-40 squadrons with each other in the Mediterranean theater for a certain time period, and they found the 99th was flying just as well as the other P-40 squadrons. So there was no reason to take it out of combat. In fact, something else happened. The 332nd Fighter Group, in the meantime, had been started at Tuskegee Army Airfield with 3 other fighter squadrons, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd. And the 332nd Fighter Group And those 3 fighter squadrons assigned to it went overseas in early 1944. And so the 99th was over there with P-40s flying for the 12th Air Force when the 332nd Fighter Group and its 3 squadrons went overseas. They were assigned to the 12th Air Force too, but they weren't flying P-40s. They were flying P-39 aircraft. P-40s and P-39s were good aircraft for attacking targets on the ground, for supporting ground forces, things that the 12th Air Force did. But they weren't good aircraft for shooting down enemy aircraft or for escorting bombers. That wasn't their mission at the time. So the Tuskegee Airmen didn't have much opportunity to shoot down enemy aircraft or to fly over deep into enemy territory. That changed, though, in the middle of 1944. This is a picture of a P-40. There's a P-40 right over there in the same hangar space we're in now. But that's the same type of aircraft the Flying Tigers flew in the China-Burma-India theater. They didn't fly hand-me-down P-40s from the Flying Tigers. That's one of the misconceptions. But they flew the same type of aircraft. The 332nd Fighter Group, as I mentioned, had a symbol, had an emblem that looked like this. They had a Black Panther spitting fire. And you see it says Spitfire. It could be that when the emblem was designed, there was an expectation they might be flying British fighter aircraft called Spitfires. But that's not what happened. They didn't fly British Spitfires. They never flew British Spitfires. They flew P-39s at first. And then in the middle of 1944, 2 dramatic things happened. The 99th Fighter Squadron was assigned to the 332nd Fighter Group. The Black Fighter Squadron was assigned to the Black Fighter Group, giving the Black Fighter Group, the 332nd Fighter Group, 4 squadrons instead of 3. And that's something unusual about the Tuskegee Airmen. The 332nd Fighter Group had 4 fighter squadrons. Most of them had 3 fighter squadrons. The reason is the 99th was assigned to the 332nd. The other big change in the middle of 1944 is the Tuskegee Airmen started flying for the 15th Air Force. And 15th Air Force had B-17 bombers, 4-engine bombers, B-24 bombers, 4-engine bombers. They needed fighter escorts. So the 332nd Fighter Group became one of 7 fighter escort groups in the 15th Air Force to escort 21 bombardment groups during World War II. 7 fighter squadrons to escort 21 bomber groups. There were more bombers to escort than there were fighters to escort them. And maybe that's one reason why they reassigned the 332nd Fighter Group with its 4 squadrons to take part with the escort of the bombers. B-17 bombers, B-24 bombers had crews of about 10 men. And so every bomber that went down, that would be a loss of 10 men. If 30 bombers went down, that'd be 300 men. So it's very important to have fighter escorts. They needed different planes to do the fighter escort. P-39s wouldn't work, P-40s wouldn't work. So they started flying P-47 aircraft, P-51 aircraft. And those were much better because they were faster, they were more maneuverable, they had higher speed, and they had a longer range. So they were advanced over the aircraft the Tuskegee Airmen had flown before. They had more chance to shoot down enemy aircraft. They had more chance to fly deep into enemy territory as they escorted the bombers, their new mission. This is a picture of a B-17 Flying Fortress, and in another hangar, of course, you can see one. In fact, I think there are 2 different hangars that have B-17s in it. The B-24 was similar, and you'll see a picture of that in just a little while. This is the type of plane that the Tuskegee Airmen are most known for, and at this point, I better mention something. When we think of the Tuskegee Airmen, we think of the pilots, but most Tuskegee Airmen were not pilots. For every man in the air, there were many more on the ground. There were a total of about 14,000 plus Tuskegee Airmen, if you count the personnel on the ground. There were almost 1,000 pilots. So most Tuskegee Airmen were on the ground supporting the pilots in the units that the Tuskegee Airmen belonged to, that the Tuskegee Airmen pilots belonged to. The P-51 Mustang had a red tail for the 332nd Fighter Group. All of the P-51 groups who flew to escort bombers for the 15th Air Force had distinctively painted tails. The 332nd Fighter Group had the solid red tail that you see on one of the planes out on display. The Bunny has a solid red tail. But the other groups had distinctive markings. The 52nd Fighter Group, for example, had yellow tails. And the 325th Fighter Group had black and yellow checkerboard pattern tails. The 31st Fighter Group had striped red tails. So each of the P-51 groups had its own distinctive color design. The red tails, possibly members of the 31st Fighter Group could call themselves red tails. They had striped red tails. But the Tuskegee Airmen had the solid red tails, like the one you see pictured. They were stationed at Ramitelli Field in Italy during their bomber escort missions, and they flew all of those bomber escort missions, plus some other missions like strafing, between June of 1944 and the end of April 1945. So they gained most of their fame in that time period, beginning of June 1944, end of April 1945. They escorted bombers during that time. They flew 312 missions for the 15th Air Force, and 179 of those missions were bomber escort missions. So the majority of the missions during that time were bomber escort missions. Each of the fighter groups had its own base. Madna Field, which was near Ramitelli, had the 52nd Fighter Group with the yellow tails. So the yellow tails and the red tails were stationed right near each other, flying the same kinds of missions on the same kinds of operations. This is a picture of a B-24 Liberator, very similar to a B-17. The 15th Air Force had B-17s and B-24s. My own father was a B-24 bomber pilot during World War II, but he was stationed with the 8th Air Force in England during World War II. So he wasn't escorted by the Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen were with the 15th Air Force in Italy, flying missions from Ramitelli. The Tuskegee Airmen remember certain missions, but one of the ones they remember most of all was the mission to Berlin in March of 1945. They flew all the way to Berlin, and during that mission they shot down 3 German jets, Me-262s like you see in the picture. They weren't the only group on that mission. There was another fighter group, the 31st Fighter Group, with striped red tails, that also shot down German jets over Berlin on the same mission. But the Tuskegee Airmen were there, and 3 Tuskegee Airmen each got credit for shooting down one of those German jets. That was March 24th, 1945. The most famous of all the Tuskegee Airmen was Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. He had gone to West Point. His father was the first black general in the Army. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. eventually became the first black general in the Air Force. But Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. commanded the 99th Fighter Squadron when it went overseas, then commanded the 332nd Fighter Group when it went overseas, and then he eventually became the commander of the 477th Bombardment Group, which was another Tuskegee Airmen organization that flew B-25s, but it never did deploy overseas. One reason was because it wasn't activated until 1944. It was later in the war, and it took longer to train bomber crews than it did to train fighter pilots. So it took longer to train the 477th. I'll tell you a little bit more about the 477th in a minute. These are some statistics about the Tuskegee Airmen. They shot down 112 enemy airplanes, and that includes the 99th Fighter Squadron before the 332nd Fighter Group went over there, and the fighter squadrons of the 332nd after that. There were no Tuskegee Airmen aces that shot down at least 5 enemy aircraft, but there were 3 Tuskegee Airmen who each shot down 4 enemy aircraft, and there were 4 Tuskegee Airmen who each shot down 3 in one day. One of them was Lee Archer, one of the famous Tuskegee Airmen. You'll hear more about him in just a minute. They flew approximately 1,500 missions And that's counting the missions of the 99th before the 332nd went over there. Missions of the 332nd before it joined the 15th Air Force and started the heavy bomber escort missions. So it includes all the missions that they flew. And as I said, 179 of the 312 missions they flew for the 15th Air Force were bomber escort missions. And those bomber escort missions, 179 missions, they lost bombers to enemy aircraft on only 7 of those missions. 7 out of 179 missions. In other words, they flew 172 bomber escort missions without losing bombers. And the total number of bombers that were shot down under their escort, because sometimes a mission would lose more than 1 bomber on a mission, was 27. The average number of bombers lost by the other fighter groups in the 15th Air Force was 46. The average number lost by the other P-51 groups in the 15th Air Force was over 60. So they lost considerably fewer bombers than the other bomber groups, than the other fighter escort groups of the 15th Air Force. Some of the Tuskegee Airmen were shot down and became prisoners of war. One of them was Alexander Jefferson. I got to meet him, got to see him. I joined the Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated in 2008 and met him before that, actually, because he came to Maxwell Air Force Base to do some research on the question of numbers of bombers lost while under Tuskegee Airmen escort. Alexander Jefferson wrote a book about his experiences called Red Tail Captured, Red Tail Free. He recently died. He lived in Detroit. But Alexander Jefferson told about when he was shot down, he was eventually taken to a German prisoner of war camp. And interestingly enough, the German prisoner of war camps didn't separate the prisoners by race. They separated them by officers over here, enlisted over there. And so Alexander Jefferson was incarcerated with white pilots, with white officers, navigators, bombardiers, other white officers, and black officers too. So there was not as much racial segregation in the Stalag as there was back in Alabama. It's ironic when you think about it. There were other Tuskegee Airmen. There were 31 Tuskegee Airmen who became prisoners of war. One of them was Harold Brown. He also recently passed away, but he wrote a book too. I think it was called Keep Your Airspeed Up. And he described his experiences as a POW very similar to the experiences of Alexander Jefferson when he was a prisoner of war in Nazi Germany. The 477th Bombardment Group was that bombardment group that flew B-25s, and Tuskegee Airmen pilots who flew AT-10s at Tuskegee Army Airfield went to the 477th Bombardment Group. But it had more trouble. It started later in the war, and it had white commanders at first. There were white officers in charge of the 477th, and there were black officers who had trained to be pilots, got their wings, were officers, were also assigned to the 477th, and there was friction. It was at Selfridge Field, Michigan at first, and then it moved to Godman Field, Kentucky. At Godman Field, Kentucky, there was a question about the officers' club. Would the black officers use the white officers' club, or would there be a question about integration of the officers' club? Well, the black officers at the 477th Bombardment Group could use the officers' club at Godman Field. The white officers did not use it. They went next door to Fort Knox and used the officers' club there. So in a way, it delayed the controversy over integrating the officers' club until the Tuskegee Airmen moved to another base, Freeman Field, Indiana. At Freeman Field, Indiana, there was no Fort Knox next door. So the commander, Robert Selway, Colonel Robert Selway, the white commander, decided to have separate facilities. He pretended one set of facilities was for the trainers, the other set of facilities were for the trainees. And that wasn't the real division. The real division was the whites would use certain facilities, the blacks would use other facilities. And so Robert Selway, unlike Noel Parrish at Tuskegee, was trying to enforce segregation on the base in violation of the new War Department regulations that said there would be no racial segregation on the bases and the recreational facilities and the officers' clubs. So Robert Selway had a problem. There was a mutiny called the Mutiny, and I don't want to get into too much detail because I want to allow some time for questions and answers after. But let me just say that a total of 120 black officers were arrested at Freeman Field, Indiana, some of them for trying to enter the Whites-Only Officers Club, and some of them for refusing to sign a segregation policy of Robert Selway, the base commander. And so 120 refused to sign or tried to enter the club, were arrested. It became a national controversy. And ultimately what the Air Force decided to do was reassign all of the white commanders of the 477th Bombardment Group to other groups and make the 477th, like the 332nd before it, all black. And guess who they chose to be the commander? They chose Benjamin O. Davis Jr. because the war in Europe had just ended. And he became the commander of the 477th as he had been the commander of the 332nd before that and the 99th before that. This is the type of bomber they flew, the B-25, the same kind of bomber used by the Doolittle Raiders in April of 1942. But they never went overseas, partly because of the controversy over the racial controversies over where they were stationed, and partly because it started so late. This is a picture of Robert Selway, the commander of the 477th Bombardment Group, who tried to maintain the old segregation policy of base facilities. This is one of my favorite pictures of the Tuskegee Airmen. It shows Benjamin O. Davis Jr., the commander of the 332nd Fighter Group at the time, receiving a Distinguished Flying Cross from his father, Benjamin O. Davis Sr., the first black general in the Army. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. eventually became the first black general in the Air Force. So in a way, you could look at this picture and say, okay, here's the first black general in the Army and ultimately the first black general in the Air Force. That was taken in the summer of 1944 while they were at Ramitelli. Daniel Chappie James is another Tuskegee Airman. He was assigned to the 477th Bombardment Group, and he eventually became the first black four-star general. He didn't go overseas and fly in combat in World War II, but he did fly in combat in Korea and in Vietnam. In fact, a lot of Tuskegee Airmen did that. At the end of World War II, they wanted to continue to fly, and airlines weren't hiring black pilots very well. So that many of them who wanted to continue to fly stayed in the Air Force. The Air Force started in 1947, right after World War II. And many of them flew not only in World War II, but in Korea and in Vietnam. This is one of them, Charles McGee. Charles McGee flew fighter combat operations in World War II, in Korea, and Vietnam. He flew a total of 409 combat missions. He was the recipient in the Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated of the first Noel Parrish Medal, and that's what he's wearing there. He was he eventually was promoted, given an honorary promotion just a few years ago, just before he died. He was promoted to the honorary rank of general. The first 3 black generals in the Air Force were all Tuskegee Airmen: Benjamin O. Davis Sr., Daniel Chappie James, and Lucius Theus. But the 4th, if you count the honorary promotion of Charles McGee, was McGee himself. President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981 in 1948, the year after the Air Force was born, separating from the Army. The Army Air Forces eventually became the Air Force to all intents and purposes. But the Air Force started in 1947. The integration order, the Executive Order 9981, was issued in 1948. It wasn't immediately implemented, but there was a mandate by the President that all the armed forces would be integrated. And the Air Force took large steps toward that in 1949, when the 332nd Fighter Group and the 332nd Fighter Wing, which had been created over it under Benjamin O. Davis Jr., and its squadrons were inactivated, and their personnel were reassigned to formerly all-white units. I think, by hindsight, you know, we say hindsight is 20/20. Probably what should have happened was, instead of inactivating those black units and assigning their personnel to formerly all-white units, they should have preserved those units and just assigned white personnel to them. But that's not the way it happened. The Tuskegee Airmen were honored. Congress passed legislation in 2006 to honor all the Tuskegee Airmen by creating a gold medal in their honor, a gold medal that today exists at the Smithsonian Institution. In 2007, the medal was unveiled by President George W. Bush. You might remember that ceremony. Every Tuskegee Airman didn't get a Congressional Gold Medal. The Congressional Gold Medal was to honor all of them collectively. But many of the Tuskegee Airmen got replicas, bronze replicas of this gold medal. Here's some Tuskegee Airmen misconceptions, and I'll try to cover these in the next 10 minutes so we have some time for questions and answers. But I do want to cover some of the misconceptions, some false claims that erupted, not necessarily by Tuskegee Airmen themselves, but by people who didn't really know what actually happened. And some of these came about from working at the Air Force Historical Research Agency and receiving questions about, did this happen, did that happen? And researching those questions helped answer a lot of these questions. One of them was the question, were the Tuskegee Airmen inferior? Remember, the Army had thought they were so inferior that they couldn't be pilots in the military. That was refuted by the Tuskegee Airmen. Remember, the P-40 unit, the 99th, had demonstrated it could fly just as well as those other P-40 units in the Mediterranean theater. Another example was they lost fewer bombers, significantly fewer bombers on their bomber escort missions than the other groups. And in a 2-day period, I didn't mention this, over Anzio, the 99th Fighter Squadron shot down more enemy aircraft than the other squadrons in the area. Probably the most common misconception that was in circulation for many years was the misconception that on their bomber escort missions, the Tuskegee Airmen never lost a bomber to enemy aircraft. That was always false. But people hadn't really researched it. I hadn't researched it myself. I had heard the claim, and I believed it too. And then when I started research on the aerial victory credits of the Tuskegee Airmen and how many enemy aircraft they shot down, remember they shot down 112 enemy aircraft. In the course of my research, I found evidence from their own narrative mission reports and from the missing aircrew reports that there were some bombers escorted by the Tuskegee Airmen's 332nd Fighter Group and its squadrons that were shot down by enemy aircraft. A total of 27 on 7 missions. Lee Archer was one of those Tuskegee Airmen, one of 4 who shot down 3 enemy aircraft in one day, one of 3 Tuskegee Airmen who shot down a total of 4 enemy aircraft. And one of the misconceptions is that he was an ace and one of his victories had been taken away from him. While the evidence shows that during World War II, he claimed a total of 4 enemy aircraft and he got credit for every one of those. He got 1 on July 18, 1944 and 3 on October 12, 1944. So he had 4 enemy aircraft. I knew Lee Archer over the years, and he came to Maxwell Air Force Base, and we talked about this, and he, before he died, he was accepting of the fact that there wasn't one taken away, that he actually, during World War II, claimed 4 and got credit for all 4. Another misconception is that Roscoe Brown, who was one of those 3 Tuskegee Airmen who shot down a jet over Berlin, March 24th, 1945, that he was the first American to shoot down a German jet. Well, that's not true. He wasn't the first American. He was trying to show that he was the first Tuskegee Airman to do so. And that got twisted into the first American to shoot down a German jet. There were many German jets shot down by American pilots before that Berlin mission. Roscoe Brown is another one of those Tuskegee Airmen I got to meet over the years. He became one of the most famous Tuskegee Airmen. He was there at the 2007 award ceremony where the gold medal was unveiled. Charles McGee, I mentioned, flew 409 combat missions, counting the missions he flew in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. But he doesn't have more fighter combat missions in those 3 wars than any other Air Force pilot. There were at least 2 other Air Force pilots who also flew fighters in the same 3 wars who had more than 409. So even though it's a very commendable accomplishment that he got 409 combat mission, flew 409 combat missions, it wasn't more than any other Air Force pilot. Another misconception is that the Tuskegee Airmen shot down sank a German warship. There was a claim that the Tuskegee Airmen had destroyed a German warship in the Adriatic Sea. They did attack a German warship, in that place, that time, but the records, the naval records of the ships show that the only ship that was there at the same time in the same place was a TA-22, which was a former Italian destroyer from World War I that had been converted to German use. It was attacked by the Tuskegee Airmen, but it did not sink that day. It didn't sink until it was scuttled months later in World War II, right after the end of World War II, off of Trieste. And the last misconception I want to mention is in 1949, the 332nd Fighter Group took part in the first U.S. Air Force gunnery meet in Las Vegas. There were 2 categories. There were fighter groups that flew propeller aircraft, and there were fighter groups that flew jet aircraft. The 332nd Fighter Group won the propeller aircraft category, but they weren't competing with the jet aircraft because the jet aircraft category had a different number of events. So they had 2 different classes, the jet fighter groups and the propeller aircraft groups. The 332nd Fighter Group was not the overall winner at Las Vegas in 1949. But it did win the propeller aircraft category. The 4th Fighter Group won the jet aircraft category. So that was another misconception. By February 2024, there were possibly 3 surviving red tail combat pilots. Maybe only 2. One of them is George Hardy, who I know personally. Another one is Harry Stewart, who I also know personally. And another possibility is Charles Cooper. We don't know if he's still alive or not. Researchers are trying to determine that. But there's possibly only 2 red tail combat pilots that are still alive. And it shows that many of the Tuskegee Airmen we've known over the years are no longer with us, like Bob Friend, who used to live in this area. These are 3 of the Tuskegee Airmen books I wrote. I don't have copies of the middle one, which I co-authored with Joseph Caver and Jerome Ennals. But I do have some copies of the Tuskegee Airmen chronology and copies of Misconceptions about the Tuskegee Airmen. After some questions and answers, I'll be glad to autograph copies if you'd like to purchase one for $10. Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention.